Hello, my name is Scott Jeske and I'm a filmmaker, YouTuber, and Dehancer user. In this video, I will perform a start-to-finish demo of how to emulate a few film looks with your footage using the Dehancer plugin. Now let's begin the fun part, choosing our film profiles and grading. The clip that I'll be grading initially is a Blackmagic camera using Gen 5 color, so I will choose that for my input. Now, it should be noted that I am editing one particular shot, which in this case is very low key and high contrast. These exact settings likely won't apply directly to a different shot and should be taken as educational, though by no means a template for achieving a potential look. Results will vary. The colors look neutral, so I will not be adjusting temperature or exposure. For display purposes, I have my print set to linear so that I can see each film profile displayed as close to as normal as possible without the effect of a print stock like 2383 changing my perception of how the prior modules are affecting the image. I'm going to go for a 16mm look, so I will be choosing the Kodak Vision 3 200T stock. There's an option to push and pull the film, and in this case, Dehancer samples 3 different film exposures that allow for variations in color and contrast of the same stock. This is why in movies, the same stock can look very different depending on how it is exposed and how it is pushed and pulled in the processing. This also allows for additional finesse over block shadows and blown out highlights. In this case, I'm happy with the color, contrast, and exposure, and I won't be adjusting push and pull. Now, this is a 200T tungsten stock, but it can always be corrected for daylight, and many notable cinematographers exclusively use tungsten balanced film, so it's not a problem using it for daylight scenes or mixed temp scenes such as this. In this case, it's displaying as warm because all Dehancer profiles are designed for source material with neutral white balance. In essence, the profiles have all been pre-balanced to neutral. Regardless, it's a bit warmer than what I'm after for this mixed temp scene, so I'm going to jump down to the color head module and click Enable. I'm going to shift the midtones tone to -36 to cool off the overall image. Then reduce some of the warmth in the shadows by shifting the shadow tone to -23. That looks pretty good, but the whole image has shifted a little too far to magenta for my taste. So I'm going to push the magenta green slider to 4, adding some green to compensate. And I'm liking that. Now, as we jump back up to the film developer, film compression, expand, and print modules, this is really where we can dial in the look of our film exactly as we want. I always say that it helps to know what specific film look you are going for before making too many adjustments. Otherwise, you might end up either getting lost in the woods or creating a look that does not look like film. In this case, I know that I'm going for a more pronounced, rough 16mm 7219 look. I'm going to enable Film Developer, which emulates the process of developing a film recipe. If you like rich, saturated looks, this is also the module where you are going to best be able to dial in that particular look. The color separation is already at 100, and that's where I'd like it. Color separation essentially controls the sensitivity of each color layer. Reducing color separation will first reduce the most intense colors, while medium and low saturation colors will remain unaffected. In this instance, I'm going to boost the contrast to 30, but I'm still going for a low contrast 16mm look that you might find in a movie like Spencer. By increasing the contrast, I've also adjusted the gamma, so I am going to use gamma correction to compensate. And I'll be lifting that to 14. I'll also boost the colors slightly to 16. But I don't want to push it too far because I care more about color density than overall saturation. What's nice about this tool is that it emulates the dyes of film that control saturation, So this enhancement will keep your colors from clipping beyond the color gamut. Next, we will enable film compression, which essentially allows for manipulation of the tonal range and redistribution of the highlights, allowing for a more analog process. Once parameters are set, impact will affect the overall tonal compression. Lowering the white point will increase overall contrast of the compressed range and thus increase clipping in the highlights. Increasing the white point will flatten the highlights and introduce more gray. Tonal range represents the overall width of range that is affected by the compression tool, meaning that 0 has no effect, and 100 will affect the entire range of the image. I'm going to start pushing around some of my parameters. I'm going to leave my white point at 100 and adjust my tonal range to 39. And next, we get one of my favorite properties of Dehancer's film emulation, color density. This is where we start to see not what we might perceive as increased saturation, but rather richer and deeper primary colors, such as blue and red. You also see more density of the browns in the skin tone. I'm going to increase this to 100, but in many cases that might be too much. Depending on your footage, at a starting point, you might be lacking in contrast. This is where the expand tool arrives at the perfect point in the color pipeline, allowing you to essentially adjust your contrast and fine-tune your black point and your white point. I like it where it is, so I'm going to leave it, but I might fine-tune later. Now we come to our second point of instituting a defined look that may be familiar to us in a film pipeline. In this case, we have linear, which is essentially a pure undefined output print that doesn't have the characteristics of a print, film, or print photographic paper, only the properties that you have already implemented into the color pipeline. Next, we have Cineon Film Log, which allows for printing negatives outside of Dehancer or applying a custom print look or post-DI. And then the two most common modern print stocks, Fujifilm 3513 print film and Kodak 2383 print film. Two looks that you might be most familiar with if you remember the final days of film projection in cinemas. Lastly, we have Kodak Endura Glossy Paper, which is most similar to linear and reflects only the characteristics of printing to that specific paper. This, I would say, is the second of the two largely unaffected normal looks. At the beginning of your process, it's important to have a print selected so that you can display your final output properly as you are affecting the prior modules. In this case, I'll remind you that we started with linear. This would be my recommendation as well. You can always go back, change the print stock later, and go back and adjust your modules. What's so great about Dehancer is that it emulates all the control points within a traditional photochemical film process, and you can always tweak points along the way, a luxury only afforded by a digital pipeline. In this case, I'm not going to tweak my print until I've settled on a profile. I will choose Kodak Endura Glossy Paper. From here, I'm going to enable the analog range limiter to keep all the parameters of color and contrast within a realistic analog range. Once again, you have exposure, tonal contrast, color density, and saturation. But this time at the end of the pipeline to make any final adjustments to your overall look. I've already made my color head adjustments as well, so anything done in print means I'm good to go with my photographic look. For the 16mm look that I'm going for, I'll be leaving everything as it is, but once again, I'm going to increase the color density. In this case, I'll increase it to 65 to add a richness and depth to some of those primary colors and skin tones. It's a little oversaturated, but the good news is I can adjust in the saturation tool, bringing it down to 91. You'll notice that this tool is only meant for desaturation and not increasing saturation, as that wouldn't be realistic within an analog print pipeline, since printing is the final part of the process. Now, it should be said that these particular settings are applicable to the shot that I am demoing here, but that doesn't mean that these settings are a cut and paste solution for a different shot. I'm merely displaying the principles of each module using only the shot that I have at hand. We've established our overall color look, and even just from the colors and tonality, this already looks quite a bit like film. Next, we'll jump into the Film Grain tool. Now you may have noticed that Dehancer has added some major improvements with preset drop-down options for quick selections, with the ability to customize to your further liking. Let's start with 16mm ISO 250 preset, then adjust if needed. For demo purposes, we'll adjust. Let's take a look at the mode. Firstly, negative grain is more pronounced in the highlights and has a higher micro contrast, while positive grain produces a more soft grain, which is less pronounced in the highlights. I prefer the way positive integrates with the underlying footage, so that's what I'll be choosing. Now both films can be processed in analog or digital. The main difference is the processing power of your machine that is required. Analog is more complex and thus requires more processing, whereas digital might be preferred for quick processing and dailies. Now each section of this module is fairly self-explanatory. Size refers to the size of the grain granules. Amount is essentially how much grain is visually perceived. Resolution can most easily be thought of as blur or degradation or enhancement of perceived resolution or clarity. Shadows, midtones, and highlights will all affect the extent to which you can visibly perceive the grain within each of those tonal ranges. And chroma refers to the grain chromaticity or saturation. Now, as mentioned in previous iterations of Dehancer, this section was completely custom and not drop-down, but now you are able to use the appropriate parameters to your desired look as a jumping off point. I'm happy with the way this looks and will not be adjusting any further. Now, it should be noted that although reducing resolution can make for the most realistic emulation of lower resolution stocks when presented in a high quality format such as ProRes, platforms such as YouTube will not handle the nuance appropriately and will compress the image heavily, losing much of the nuance and detail. This being the case, I would experiment with your film resolution and its relation to your uploads to see which is best for a compressed online format. I've found compression-reliant platforms like YouTube unfortunately tend to better render the more resolute film grain, so this preset will hold up well. From here we will enable our halation, which simply put is the film emulsion effect visible as the local red-orange halos around bright light sources as they contrast with dark edges. Halation can produce red glare in the midtones, often affecting skin tones, but I like to exercise restraint and try not to go overboard with halation, thus diminishing the realism of the effect. The red glare in the midtones most often can be found in Super 8 footage, in which halation is more unrestrained than you would find in 35mm film, for instance. But in this case of 16mm, halation can be quite saturated and pronounced. For display purposes, I'm going to zoom to 200% and hone in on a high contrast area so that we can affect the halation in a realistic manner rather than affecting it until we see it within the big picture. So let's customize. Your source limiter will affect the sources within the image that can produce halation. This is helpful when, for instance, you don't want it appearing in places that it shouldn't, for instance, midtones or skin. As with the grain, you can now select a custom preset halation as a jumping off point in Dehancer. For demo purposes, I will start entirely from scratch, just to show you how each slider works. You can also use a mask mode to see the affected areas, but I like to first amplify halation and then affect the more fine parameters after, once I really can see what I'm working with. In this case, I'm going to increase the amplification all the way to 100, giving the halation a richness in density and saturation. Next, I'm going to affect the hue. Every stock is different when it comes to the hue of halation, but I tend to like it when it's cast further towards the yellow-orange, though in this case I think a red would be most appropriate for 16mm, so I'm going to increase to 70. Blue compensation will reduce some of the blues in the highlights that dampen halation and add some of that warmth which you often find with film. In this case, I will set this at 33. I'm going to zoom out to 100% so I can see the overall effect. Smoothness is essentially distribution of the halo effect. I like it to be a little more jagged and more pronounced in the most contrasty areas, so I'm going to increase this number to 78. Local diffusion will increase the geometric size of the halation, while global diffusion affects the secondary glare pronounced by scattered light. This will be more noticeable in the lower contrast midtones. In this case, I want to leave global diffusion alone, and although I like to keep halation as tight as possible, for 16mm, it's okay to pronounce it a little more. So I'm going to push the local diffusion, or radius of the halation, to 16. Although I initially zoomed into 200%, it is important to switch between 200% and fit to screen to make sure that you are not over or underdoing it in any part of the image. Halation is an amazing tool that we've only really had access to in the past few years, but it can be overdone to an unrealistic effect when its reactive properties are not studied or understood. You can always have fun and get creative, but I find it's helpful to reference real samples of film in order to get the most realistic effects. Now, after adding halation, I'm finding that the image overall is looking a little too magenta. This is due in part to the influence of the halation. The good news is I can go back and tweak my color head. I'm going to adjust the magenta green slider to 7. Next, we'll enable bloom. But for 16mm film, there does tend to be some blooming influence. In this case, we can choose 16mm. Or do custom. The preset looks great, but I will do a custom effect for demo purposes. Based on our previous modules, each control is fairly self-explanatory and not dissimilar from what we found with halation. In this instance, the effect right out of the gate is a bit too extreme for my taste, so I am going to first effect the source limiter, reducing the bloom to certain parts of the image, setting my value at 54. Next, I'm going to increase the details to 60 to get a little bit of glint in the highlights. I'm going to leave diffusion where it is, and I'm going to leave save lights and saturation where they are. As I mentioned before, I don't want this effect to be too heavy-handed, so this is an instance where I'm by and large going to be using the impact tool and reducing it all the way down to 23, so that the effect is barely there. I'm going to enable and disable just to show you the subtlety of my adjustments. Next, we have Film Damage, a new module for FCPX. I'm going to start with Super 16, and then I'm going to customize. Right off the bat, I know I want some damage, but I don't want it to look like an old film per se. I'll remove scratches altogether. I like the hairs, but I'll reduce them to 2. Personally, I like when hairs are white and dust is black, but that choice is up to you. I'll increase my dust amount to 30 and increase the white-black ratio to 90. For hairs amount, let's increase to 28. I like the look of that, but let's decrease the scale of the hairs to 17. And let's leave the white-black balance where it is. Our next module is Film Breath. Film breath is an effect you don't often see in movies anymore because it is by and large eliminated in the digital intermediate process. However, if you watch Christopher Nolan movies which are processed photochemically, you can still see the breathing even in digital formats of the films. Film breath is essentially variations in exposure, contrast, tonality, and color, as the frames have varying unevenness of emulsion and coating. Simply put, it's the flickering effect that one might notice on a movie projected on film. I'm going to do this one fully custom. The longer the period, the smoother the variance is. A lower number will produce a more flickering and jerky effect. Exposure, tonal contrast, and color are all parameters that are affected by the film breadth. I don't want any variations in my color, so I will reduce this to 0. I don't want a ton of variation in my exposure either, so I will shift that number to 1. But I do like to see a little dance in my tonal contrast when it comes to breathing, so I will set that number at 2. So all my parameters have been adjusted, and I will decrease my period to 1, just so you can see the overall effect. But now I'm going to increase my period to 3 so that the effect is a little more subtle. And just to show you a more extreme version of what this looks like, here it is on the 8mm setting. And finally comes the characteristic of film that many forget, in part because it is often stabilized in the digital post-process, but you will notice the effect more from older movies, particularly when you look at the text in the opening title sequences, and that effect is gate weave, which is essentially the mechanical swing of a film strip as the sprockets miss their sprocket holes. For learning purposes, let's again start this one from scratch. I tend to keep the period low, at 3. I don't personally like the look of rotation being affected, so I will reduce that to 0. I'll make sure auto zoom is enabled and keep the gate weave somewhere between 0 and 29 for translation of the X and Y axes. For the 16mm look, I don't mind the film bouncing around a little bit, so I like where this is at. The next module is Vignette. In this case, we will use one simply to help focus our subject and give a bit of the illusion of a projected image. I don't want this to affect the overall exposure of the image, and it's darkening the center of the image more than I would prefer, so I'm going to increase the size to 95. Spreading the vignette out from the middle of the image. I like that the way it is. And when you're done establishing your full emulation, you can apply false color to make sure your footage is still properly exposed and in the lighting ratios that you want it to be in. Although we made this particular recipe for this particular shot, one must again bear in mind that it is seldom as simple as cut and paste. Every shot has variances in contrast, saturation, etc., which is where the black and white points in the expand tool will come in particularly handy. But also, halation will especially vary depending on the contrast ratios as well. All that to say, there are so many options for how you can apply Dehancer. You can create an overall recipe as an adjustment layer, especially if your shots are all filmed and lit consistently, or you can tweak shot to shot or scene to scene. And within each stock, there's an infinite number of looks. And likewise, here are the same exact settings on different shots. The most exciting thing about Dehancer is that there is no inherent look. As with real film processing, there are infinite ways to determine a specific photographic look that is appropriate for telling your story. So although I have demonstrated for you how to use the tools, there are unlimited ways in which you can vary the look and feel of each of your projects, even when using the same film profiles and print stocks. And though it's helpful to study traditional film, the creative possibilities for what you can create in the pipeline are limitless. Thank you for watching, and please let the team at Dehancer know if you have any questions about Dehancer for Final Cut Pro X.